Imagine for a moment that you are 21 years old. You have lost your throne. You are in exile, alone in the desert, with enemies who want you dead. The man you need to meet is the most powerful person in the world, and he is surrounded by soldiers who would arrest you on sight. What do you do? Do you give up, or do you find a way, any way, to walk into that room and change the course of history? This is not a story from a film or a novel. This happened. The woman who faced that impossible moment went on to become one of the most extraordinary figures the ancient world ever produced. Her name was Cleopatra, and 2,000 years after her death, we still cannot stop talking about her. Welcome to English Through Great Stories. Today we explore the life of Cleopatra VII, the last queen of ancient Egypt. Her story is one of intelligence, ambition, love, loss, and ultimately the end of a civilization. But it is also something more personal than that. It is a story about what it means to fight for what you believe in, even when the entire world is against you. To understand Cleopatra, we first need to understand her world. Picture the city of Alexandria in the 1st century before the Common Era, roughly 2,000 years ago. It was one of the greatest cities on Earth. Its famous library held hundreds of thousands of scrolls. Its lighthouse was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Ships from Greece, Rome, Persia, and Africa filled its enormous harbor. It was a city of ideas, wealth, and extraordinary power. Egypt itself was ancient even then. Its pyramids were already 1,500 years old. Its gods, its language, its traditions stretched back thousands of years into the deep past. But the rulers of Egypt in Cleopatra's time were not Egyptian by blood. They were Greek, descendants of one of Alexander the Great's generals, a man named Ptolemy. For nearly 300 years, the Ptolemaic dynasty had ruled Egypt as their own private kingdom. Most of the Ptolemaic rulers did not bother to learn Egyptian. They spoke Greek. They lived like Greek royalty, and they kept Egypt's native people at a distance. But Cleopatra was different. She was, according to ancient sources, the first ruler of her dynasty to actually speak the Egyptian language. She also spoke several others: Greek, Latin, Aramaic, Hebrew, and more. Language was one of her most powerful tools, and she used every one of them. But the world Cleopatra inherited was not a stable one. By the time she was born, around 69 BCE, Egypt's power was fading. Rome was rising. The Roman Republic, centered far to the west on the banks of the Tiber River, had been expanding aggressively for generations. It had already absorbed much of the Mediterranean world: Greece, Spain, North Africa. Egypt had managed to remain independent, partly through careful diplomacy, and partly because Rome still needed Egyptian grain. But the balance was increasingly fragile. But the splendor of Alexandria hid a darker truth. Cleopatra had been born into a world where the price of power was survival, and where your closest enemy could be your own blood. Chapter 1: A Kingdom in Danger. Cleopatra grew up inside the royal palace of Alexandria, a place of extraordinary luxury, but also of constant danger. Royal families in the ancient world were rarely peaceful. Brothers and sisters competed for power. Parents and children plotted against each other. Death was never far away. Cleopatra's own father, Ptolemy XII, had watched his kingdom nearly collapse around him. He had been driven out of Egypt for a time, forced to beg Rome for military support with gold that he borrowed. and that Egypt's people paid back through heavy taxation. When Ptolemy XII died in 51 BCE, Cleopatra was about 18 years old. Under his will, she became co-ruler of Egypt, alongside her younger brother Ptolemy XIII, who was just 10. In theory, they ruled together. In practice, a struggle for sole power began almost immediately. The advisors who surrounded her young brother resented Cleopatra's intelligence and her fierce independence. Within a few years, they had forced her out of Alexandria entirely. Cleopatra fled to Syria and began to raise an army. She was determined to reclaim her throne. But then something unexpected happened, something that would change everything. A Roman general named Julius Caesar arrived in Alexandria, pursuing his great rival Pompey, who had fled there after a military defeat. Pompey was killed before Caesar even arrived by agents of Ptolemy XIII, who thought this would please the Roman. It did not. Caesar was furious. He had wanted Pompey as a prisoner, not a severed head delivered as a gift. Caesar established himself in the royal palace. Both Cleopatra and her brother sent messages, hoping to win his crucial support. But Ptolemy's advisors controlled the city, and they would not let Cleopatra enter without risking her capture and her life. So Cleopatra did something bold, something almost unbelievable, something that historians have debated and marveled at ever since. She was exiled, outnumbered, and surrounded by enemies. Another person might have given up. Cleopatra had a different idea entirely. Chapter 2. The Woman Who Walked into Caesar's World. The ancient historian Plutarch tells us that Cleopatra arranged to be smuggled into the palace past her enemies, hidden inside a large bag or roll of linen, possibly a carpet. Her companion carried her through the palace gates as if delivering goods. When the bundle was unrolled in front of Caesar, Cleopatra stepped out. Imagine that moment. Caesar, 52 years old, one of the most powerful men alive, standing in a torchlit palace room, watching a 21-year-old woman emerge from a pile of cloth. What did he see? Not just beauty, though ancient sources do speak of her extraordinary charm and her voice, which they describe as musical and captivating, like a many-stringed instrument. He saw courage. He saw someone who had risked her life simply to stand in his presence. He saw intelligence in her eyes and careful calculation in her posture. Caesar was a man who understood boldness better than almost anyone alive. He recognized it immediately. By morning, Caesar had decided to support Cleopatra. He summoned both her and her brother and declared that Egypt should be ruled jointly, exactly as their father's will had required. Ptolemy's advisors were outraged. War broke out in the streets of Alexandria. Caesar's soldiers were heavily outnumbered. It was a desperate, dangerous time. So dangerous that Caesar himself is said to have swum to safety through the harbor to reach his ships, and the great library of Alexandria may have suffered fire damage during this period, one of history's greatest losses. But Caesar survived. Reinforcements arrived. Ptolemy XIII was defeated and drowned in the Nile while trying to escape. Cleopatra was queen. She was 21 years old. She had just survived a civil war, a Roman military occupation of her capital city, and an attempt by her own brother to destroy her. And she had done it not through superior military strength alone, but through intelligence, precise timing, and one extraordinary act of personal courage. Cleopatra and Caesar spent several months together in Egypt before he had to return to Rome's wars. During that time, she showed him her kingdom. They sailed together down the Nile on a magnificent royal barge, surrounded by attendants and soldiers. She showed him temples thousands of years old, cities stretching along the great river's banks, the monuments of a civilization that made Rome look young. She was teaching him something, in a sense, showing him with every mile exactly what she was worth. A son was born. Cleopatra called him Caesarion, meaning Little Caesar. Whether Julius Caesar formally acknowledged the child is a question historians still debate, but the message was clear enough. Cleopatra had tied herself to the most powerful man in the Roman world, and she had produced a possible heir who carried the blood of both Egypt's royal dynasty and Rome's greatest living general. It was a political act and a deeply human one, both at exactly the same time. But winning Egypt was only the beginning. Cleopatra's next move would take her into the very heart of Roman power and into a city that was not ready for her. Chapter 3. A Queen in Rome. Caesar returned to Rome, and then, in around 46 BCE, Cleopatra did something remarkable. She followed him. She arrived in the city with her young son and a large retinue of attendants, and she stayed in one of Caesar's personal villas just outside the city walls. She was a reigning foreign monarch, openly living as the companion of Rome's greatest man. The reaction from the Roman public was not warm. It was, in many corners of the city, furious. Rome was a deeply patriarchal society, a world where women were not expected to hold political power, let alone exercise it openly. Roman writers complained bitterly about Cleopatra's presence. They called her dangerous, seductive, a foreign threat to Roman virtue and values. The word they used was often simply queen, and in Rome that word was not a compliment. Rome had expelled its kings centuries earlier. The very idea of monarchy made Roman citizens uncomfortable. A foreign queen living openly with their greatest leader made them deeply angry. But Cleopatra was not a woman who allowed other people's opinions to define her. She had survived exile, civil war, and political betrayal before she was 22 years old. She understood that power required visibility. She dressed magnificently. She met philosophers and scholars. She was in Rome, the center of the known world, and she was gathering information, building relationships, and studying the inner machinery of the empire that surrounded her kingdom from every direction. Think for a moment about what this required of her. She was living in a city where the customs were foreign, where the language, though she spoke it, carried values that were not her own, where many people openly despised her, where her entire position depended on Caesar's continued protection and goodwill. She was far from home with a small child in a city that regarded her as an enemy. And yet she stayed, she adapted, she watched, she learned. This is a kind of courage that does not appear on any battlefield. It is quieter, but no less real. It seemed for a time that Cleopatra had secured everything she needed. Then, on a single morning in March, the world she had built was shattered in an instant. Chapter 4. The Death of Caesar and the World Reborn. On the 15th of March in the year 44 BCE, a date that Romans called the Ides of March, Julius Caesar was assassinated. He was stabbed 23 times by a group of senators who feared he was becoming a king. He died in the Senate chamber at the foot of a statue of his old rival Pompey. Rome exploded into chaos. For Cleopatra, watching from outside the city, this was a catastrophe. protector was dead, her son's father was dead, and Rome's political world had become very, very dangerous. She left Rome quickly. She had no choice. Without Caesar, she was simply a foreign queen with no allies and a growing list of powerful enemies. She returned to Egypt and waited, watching the civil wars that tore through Rome in the years that followed. Caesar's assassins, men like Brutus and Cassius, fought against Caesar's supporters, his former deputy, Mark Antony, and Caesar's young adopted son, Octavian. The Roman world was dividing, and Egypt, rich in grain and perfectly positioned on the world's trade routes, was everyone's prize. Cleopatra navigated these dangerous years with careful skill. She was formerly co-ruler once more with another younger brother, who died possibly by her order not long after her return. In the years that followed, she made her son, Caesarion, her co-ruler instead. She was consolidating power, removing threats from within, and watching the approaching storm beyond her borders with the focused attention of someone who understood that one wrong decision could mean the end of everything she had fought for. Then came the summons she had been expecting. Mark Antony, now one of the three men dividing the Roman world between them, called her to the city of Tarsus in what is now southern Turkey. He wanted to discuss Egypt's role in Rome's coming wars, and he wanted access to Egypt's enormous wealth and grain. Cleopatra understood exactly what this meeting meant. She had faced Caesar in a palace room with nothing but her courage and a roll of cloth. Now she prepared very differently. She had survived Caesar's death, Rome's chaos, and her own brother's treachery. Now a new Roman general was calling for her, and this time Cleopatra would arrive entirely on her own terms. Chapter 5. Mark Antony, Love, Alliance, or both. The historian Plutarch describes Cleopatra's arrival at Tarsus in language that has thrilled readers for 2,000 years. She sailed up the river Cydnus on a magnificent golden barge. The sails were purple, the oars were silver, moving in time with the music of flutes and pipes. She reclined beneath a canopy of cloth of gold, dressed as Aphrodite, the goddess of love. Her attendants, costumed as sea nymphs, surrounded her. The people of Tarsus left their houses and crowded to the riverbanks. Even Mark Antony's ceremonial chair, where he sat waiting to receive her, was abandoned. This was not simply theater. It was political communication at its most sophisticated. Cleopatra was sending Antony a message before she had spoken a single word to him. She was saying, "I am not a subject who comes to kneel before a Roman general. I am a goddess. I am a queen. If you want Egypt, if you want its grain, its gold, its power, you will deal with me as an equal, or you will not deal with me at all." Antony was captivated. He invited her to dinner. She countered by inviting him to dine aboard her barge instead, and the banquet she provided became legendary in its extravagance. Rose petals covered the floor to a depth that ancient sources compare to a deep carpet. Lights and colors filled the evening air. Every luxury of the ancient world was on display. Antony, a man who loved pleasure, celebration, and grand display himself, was deeply impressed. A partnership, political, military, and deeply personal, was born that evening on the warm waters of the Cydnus River. What followed was one of the most famous relationships in all of human history. Cleopatra and Mark Antony spent the winter of 41 to 40 BCE together in Alexandria. They formed a kind of intimate social circle with their closest companions. Ancient sources say they called themselves the inimitable livers. a name that celebrated their appetite for life, pleasure, and daring. They ate together, hunted together, celebrated together. But beneath the feasting, this was also strategic alliance. Egypt needed Rome's military protection. Rome needed Egypt's extraordinary wealth. Over the years that followed, their relationship deepened considerably. Cleopatra bore Antony 3 children, twins, a boy and a girl, and later another son. Antony spent increasing amounts of time in Egypt and in the eastern reaches of the Roman world. He granted Cleopatra and her children territories he controlled in the Roman East. He began to behave, in the eyes of Rome, less like a Roman general and more like an Eastern king. And in Rome itself, the young, cold, and calculating Octavian was watching all of this with growing fury. It is worth pausing here and asking the question historians have returned to for centuries. Did Cleopatra love Mark Antony, or was their connection purely political strategy? The honest answer is, we cannot know with certainty. But what we can say is this: in the ancient world, the line between love and strategy was often thin and deliberately blurred. A queen who chose a partner was choosing a protector, an ally, a co-ruler. And a woman who shared a man's life for over a decade, who bore his children, who stood beside him in both triumph and catastrophe. She was not simply making calculations. For nearly a decade, Cleopatra and Antony had built something extraordinary together. But one man in Rome had been watching all of it, and he had decided it was time for it to end. Chapter 6. The War for the World. By 32 BCE, the relationship between Antony and Octavian had collapsed completely and irreversibly. Octavian then made a remarkable, carefully calculated move. He declared war not on Antony, a Roman citizen and co-ruler, but on Cleopatra. He portrayed the coming conflict as a patriotic war to protect Roman civilization from a dangerous foreign queen who had corrupted one of Rome's greatest generals, seduced him away from his Roman wife and his Roman duties. It was brilliant propaganda. And it worked. Rome rallied behind Octavian. The decisive confrontation came in September of 31 BCE at a place called Actium, a headland on the western coast of Greece where 2 ancient seas meet. Cleopatra was present with her own fleet of warships. This itself was extraordinary, a reigning queen personally commanding vessels in a major naval battle. But the engagement did not go as planned. Octavian's brilliant admiral, Agrippa, had positioned his forces with precision. The winds and the currents shifted against Antony and Cleopatra's combined fleet. During the battle, Cleopatra's ships withdrew. Antony followed her. Ancient sources, nearly all written by Romans who supported Octavian, called this cowardice or betrayal of his own soldiers. But some modern historians suggest that withdrawal may have been part of a planned tactical strategy that simply failed under the circumstances. Whatever the full truth, the effect was devastating. Antony's remaining forces, without their commander, collapsed in disarray. The war, for all practical purposes, was over. They retreated to Alexandria. Both knew Octavian was coming and that time was running out. Antony made attempts to rally whatever forces remained. There were negotiations, tentative diplomatic overtures, desperate searches for a solution. Cleopatra reportedly attempted to open direct communication with Octavian, possibly exploring whether she could preserve Egypt's independence or at least her children's lives through some form of agreement. Octavian gave her nothing. He was marching to Egypt, and he intended to march through Alexandria itself in full Roman triumph. In August of 30 BCE, Octavian's forces entered Egypt. Antony, receiving false information, perhaps deliberately sent, that Cleopatra was already dead, fell upon his own sword. He was carried, mortally wounded, to where Cleopatra was sheltering, inside her own mausoleum, the grand tomb she had been constructing in anticipation of death. He died there, in her arms. Whatever their relationship had truly been, love, political alliance, partnership, or all three at once, it ended in that quiet, devastating moment. The battle was lost, the armies had surrendered, Antony was gone. Cleopatra now faced the most powerful man in the world, alone, and she still had one final move to make. Chapter 7. The End of an Era. Cleopatra survived a few more days. Octavian came in person to meet her. It was essential to him that she be taken alive, to be displayed in his triumph through the streets of Rome as the greatest prize of his victory. Ancient sources describe their meeting in careful detail. Cleopatra sat before the man who had destroyed everything she had built, disheveled, grieving, yet still attempting to negotiate. She presented a list of her personal treasures. A servant then betrayed her, revealing she had concealed some valuables. She defended herself with immediate ferocity, striking the servant in anger. Octavian told her she would be treated with dignity and respect. She did not believe him, or perhaps she understood something that Octavian could not quite conceal beneath his careful diplomat's tone. That for her, a Roman triumph would be a death far worse than actual death. She had been a queen. She had walked in the world as a goddess, to be displayed in chains through the streets of Rome before crowds throwing insults, while Octavian received all the glory. This was something she would not accept. Not after everything. Not at the end. On the 12th of August, in the year 30 BCE, Cleopatra died. She was 39 years old. Ancient sources say she used a snake, an asp, a small cobra, to end her life, applying it to her arm or her breast. Other ancient accounts suggest she may have used poison. The truth, like so much about Cleopatra, remains beautifully and frustratingly uncertain. What is certain is this: she chose her own death. In a world that had taken almost everything from her, she kept control of the one thing that remained, how her story ended. Octavian was frustrated, but far from finished. He ordered the execution of Caesarion, Cleopatra's son by Julius Caesar, and the only child who might one day represent a genuine dynastic threat to his own power. Her children by Antony were taken to Rome, where they were raised by Octavian's own sister. Egypt became a Roman province, personally controlled by Octavian himself, too valuable to be trusted to any governor. The Ptolemaic dynasty, which had ruled Egypt for nearly 300 years, was finished, and Octavian, who would soon rename himself Augustus, became the first emperor of Rome. The last queen of ancient Egypt was gone. But something extraordinary happened in the centuries and millennia that followed. Her story refused to disappear. Writers, artists, historians, philosophers, and poets kept returning to her again and again. Shakespeare wrote a magnificent play about her. Renaissance painters made her the subject of sweeping masterpieces. Films, novels, operas, sculptures. Her story has been told and retold in almost every form of art that human beings have ever invented. Why? What is it about Cleopatra that the world simply cannot let go? Part of the answer is that she defies every easy description. She was not simply a beauty. The ancient sources who knew her world say very little about her physical appearance, and what they do say is complicated by politics and bias. She was not simply a seductress, not simply a victim, not simply a villain. She was a scholar who spoke 9 languages at a time when most rulers spoke only 1. She was a ruler who governed one of the richest nations on earth for nearly 2 decades. She was a strategist who formed alliances with 2 of Rome's greatest men, and she did it deliberately, intelligently, on her own terms. She was also a mother who fought to secure her children's futures long after her own future had become uncertain. She was a woman who, in a world almost entirely controlled by men, Roman men at that, held real power on her own terms for as long as was humanly possible. She was not perfect. She was ruthless at times, calculating, capable of removing threats with brutal efficiency. But she was fully, completely human, and she lived one of the most complete and remarkable lives in the ancient world. The story of Cleopatra is also the story of what happens when the world changes too fast, when old powers are swallowed by new ones, when individual brilliance is simply not enough to stop historical forces far larger than any single person. Her Egypt was not merely defeated on the battlefield, it was absorbed. Its grain fed Rome, its gods were adapted and reinterpreted into new mythologies. Its knowledge, mathematics, medicine, astronomy, was carried west and became the foundation of Western science. In a strange and quiet way, Egypt outlasted its conquerors. But that is cold comfort for a queen who died at 39. Closing reflection. And now, for a final moment, let us step back from the history and simply sit with what this story asks of us. As listeners, as human beings living our own complicated, uncertain, and meaningful lives. Cleopatra lived in a world that did not want her to succeed. She was a woman in a political world built entirely for men. She was a ruler of ancient heritage trying to hold together a fragile kingdom, while the most powerful empire in history consumed everything around her. She was extraordinarily brilliant, and it was not enough. She was astonishingly brave, and it was not enough. She fought until the very last possible moment, and still she lost. The world moved on without her. It would be easy to take from this story the dark lesson that brilliance and courage are never enough, that history is decided by power and luck and timing and the size of your army, not by the quality of your mind or the depth of your character. And there is real truth in that. History is often deeply unfair. Power does not always find the most deserving hands. The world does not reliably reward those who work the hardest, prepare the most carefully, or think the most clearly. But Cleopatra's life also illuminates something else, something quieter and perhaps more durable. That how we face what we cannot control is itself a form of power. The way she walked, alone and in danger, into Caesar's torchlit room. The way she sailed, dressed as a goddess, into Antony's world. The way she sat before Octavian, grieving and defeated, and still argued, still pushed back, still refused to simply disappear. These were not failures. They were expressions of a self that refused, even at the end, to be diminished. We all face moments in our lives when the forces around us feel overwhelming, when the world seems too large and too indifferent for our individual efforts to matter, when we wonder whether preparation, intelligence, and determination are actually enough, when we feel exiled from the life we thought we were building. Cleopatra's answer to those moments, imperfect, human, and utterly real, was simply to keep going, to use every tool she had, to refuse again and again to accept other people's definitions of who she was and what she deserved. She could not save her kingdom. She could not protect every person she loved. She could not hold back the tide of Rome any more than she could hold back the tide of the Nile. But she chose, until the very last breath, who she was. She controlled, when almost nothing else remained within her power to control, the manner of her own ending. And in doing so, she transformed defeat into something that history has never quite been able to classify as simple failure. 2,000 years after her death, we still say her name. We still argue about her. We still write plays and novels and films and historical studies trying to understand her. Even now, we are still speaking her name in a language she herself once studied and mastered. That is not nothing. That is, perhaps, the most honest form of immortality available to any of us. Not to live forever, but to matter so truly, so completely, that the world cannot stop speaking of you long after you are gone. Think today about the areas of your own life where you are facing forces larger than yourself, where the outcome is uncertain, where the odds feel unfair, where you wonder whether your efforts genuinely matter. Ask yourself, what would it mean to keep going, not because victory is guaranteed, but because the act of continuing, of choosing who you are in the face of difficulty, is itself meaningful? Cleopatra did not win, but she never stopped being herself, and the world has never forgotten her for it. Thank you for listening to English Through Great Stories. Today, we walk through the life of Cleopatra VII, queen, scholar, strategist, mother, and one of the most enduring figures in all of human history. I hope the words stayed with you. I hope some of the ideas travel with you beyond this episode and into your own days. Until next time, keep listening, keep learning, and keep asking the questions that matter most.